Thank you, Tobias. Yeah, I'm actually really happy to present after the two presentations we just had, both great presentations. Thank you so much for both of you, because I'm directly touching upon the topics touched upon on both of them. So yeah, I'll be talking about the academic esports and towards more inclusive esports and how academic esports both must and can foster for more inclusive esports cultures. So what do I mean by that is that um, those, well, quite many of us are probably aware of some of the issues we have currently and have had for a longer period of time with inclusivity in esports. And given the fact that when it's moved to an academic context or educational context, there is a different, almost sort of a different level of and a framework of inclusivity it has to commit to, which both sort of creates pressure to creating more inclusive landscape for esports, but it also opens up an opportunity to do it. What this means is that within academic esports, there has to be an active dismantling of socioeconomic barriers and barriers for participation for instance, women, ethnic, gender, and sexual minorities, racial players, and disabled players. So what do we know at the moment? That esports has a lot of barriers of participation, both when we look at the sort of like amateur level and professional level. And currently, esports is by and large dominated by white, cisgender, able-bodied man and Asian man. And quite often there is also a socioeconomic factor, and these players, especially the successful ones, tend to come from middle-class backgrounds. And even though, for instance, if you look at the discourses around esports and gender in Western countries, even though Asian players tend to be extremely successful in esports, they're still fetishized, feminized, and othered in the Western discourses. So even there, they are not given the same full participations than white men, most commonly. So the participation for other groups is hindered by social, cultural, and economic barriers and discriminatory practices. And this, of course, at the level and amount of these kind of barriers tends to vary by the context. So depending what game we are looking at, what type of esport we are looking at, what professional context we are looking at, it's not always the same, but it doesn't mean that there would be areas where they do not exist. And for instance, women's ways to participate is limited and gendered from very early on. So me and my colleague Usva Freeman, we did a research on 2018 looking at the ways women discuss esports and negotiate their presence within one particular esports game, Overwatch. And what we find out that there is both huge pressure to write women out of existence and write them into existence in very particular ways. What we mean by this, and we did this research by using questionnaire data and discussion forum data, is that women were expected, in order to be able to negotiate their presence within that game community, to play only one particular character known as Mercy in the context of Overwatch, which is a character that does the role of support, which means helping other players to perform, which is also a role of an effective labor that is often expected from women in video games, both in terms of roles they're playing, but also sort of like maintaining and building communities in order to sort of get an access to participate. Women who would not want to play this particular role or this particular hero, who also was ridiculed as extremely easy hero to play, as Mercy, as I mentioned when I listened after Rory's presentation, Mercy does not depend on aiming mechanic. So Mercy is also sort of an accessible character for players who don't have aiming background or might have a disability that affects on their capacity to aim. But because aim is seen as a very important skill in a lot of the esports context, Mercy not having that skill also made her a gendered character and one easily ridiculed as easy character, which also would enforce the stereotype of women not really being able to play video games, and at the same time they would be pressured into this role where they could be partially accepted within the community, but at the same time ridiculed and put to do the effective labor. Those women who would not accept this role, who would rather play other characters, play other roles, would constantly be harassed and bullied out of this position, and their active performance within the game would also be hindered. What I mean by that, it can also be things such as other players refusing to give them resources, such as healing, to make them fail, after which they get blamed for failing. And this, what we noticed with USWA, happens from very early on, so not just on the, or even mainly on the professional level, but when you start playing video games as a young person, as soon as you start, this happens, leading to number of ways, different ways. Woman identifying players have to negotiate their existence within games, such as gender masking, which means they will not use feminine battle tags or name tags. They will not use their voice while playing video games, and they, in all ways, hide their gender. That, of course, has long-standing consequences, as we know that within esports, ability to both communicate effectively whilst playing, as well as social networking, knowing the right people, that you will get hired, that you will get included, is extremely important. Women are in many ways excluded from that, especially if they refuse to take the very narrow role given to women within this context. And this exclusion leads to extreme hindering of their future possibilities in a professional field of esports. Even if they make it to the top, even if they are able to negotiate within this complex system, they still continue often being targeted because of their gender, both through sort of negative public press, but also from very practical barriers of such as teams wanting to have full same-sex teams because of player housing, etc., etc., etc. So it's no wonder that currently, especially in mixed leagues, we do not have many professional women players. Their struggle starts from very early on and continues in the professional level. We have, in a similar way, there is barriers of participation for players of color, sexual and gender minorities, and something that has already been discussed here earlier, disabled players. And Ripet and Silvestri point out that it's really important that we forefront the body in esports to understand the ways in which disabled players are both included and excluded from esports practices. So that's actually something I'm working with my colleague from Bergen, Tom Legiers. We are currently working on a paper to understanding what do we mean by a body in esports. Because there tends to be an idea of a normatized body that is not recognized as a body that does something with the computer, even when it's recognized as a physical body of an e-athlete. So what do we mean by this is that we need to recognize the very real techno material assemblage of the body, player and the computer, to understand how those with a number of different disabilities are denied access, and not just an access to be somehow able to access the game, but to access the game in a way that it could be, which is never fully, but more meritocratic practice. Just having an access within a game that is competitive doesn't make it equal. You are in a very different footing if your access is limited in a ways that could be technologically solvable and not made limited. So one of the ways that hinders that is the discourse, what Christopher Paul has called toxic meritocracy of esports, or toxic meritocracy of gaming, the idea that everyone starts from the same line, We do not start gaming on the same line. We do not start esports at the same line. There is a number of obstacles and barriers, and depending the particular positionality one has, those obstacles are bigger or smaller. And we have to be mindful, especially in academic context, that we do not reproduce those obstacles, but we actively seek to dismantle them. Nope, different direction. So in order to look a little bit in the ways that this can be done, I'm going to be really briefly talking about 4 different important structures that we have to take into account when we actively reflect on the ways in which we make esports more inclusive. Can I even say more meritocratic? Probably not. More inclusive, a better place, a safer place, and more welcoming place for everyone. And the first structure I want to look at is the institutional structures. So what do I mean by this? Again, touching upon what was already discussed, we have clear educational structure when we look at academic esports, and that brings with it a lot of strengths because it will mandate, depending on country and legislation, it does mandate some actions of inclusivity. Institutions such as educational institutions are not perfect on that, but they are way better than many other private institutions. So one of the contexts we have is the academic or educational context, but we also have the other context and other institutional context as a esports context. And one of these things that we have to look into then is the sportification of esports. So going a little bit back what I was saying about the issues of exclusionary practices in esports and in game, a lot of them are not sure if inherited is the best word, but they were part of already gaming cultures before esports. And gaming cultures did have and gaming as an activity for long had quite a bad reputation, starting from the 70s moral panics and continuing the resurfacing of these moral panics in media for quite a long time. Gaming in mainstream media and mainstream discussions, gaming became characterized as an activity of lonely teenage boys, and it was perceived and often constructed as an activity with no social context and possibly dangerous for the young people. Now we know that all new activities, all new media forms create moral panics, so they don't really tell much about the truth. We know also that gaming has always been way more diverse, and gaming has always been extremely social activity. However, gaming has had a long history of stigma. So constructing competitive gaming as something else than competitive gaming, namely esports, can be seen as a way of also distancing competitive gaming from that stigma and bring it closer to sports, socially very accepted activity. However, this does not mean that we get rid of the problems we had with game communities and game culture just by renaming it. But what it means, we still have to address those issues, and we also have to take into account the problems that comes with sports. So I actually gonna go a little back here to say, pointing out what Rupert and Sylvester are saying, that when we use the institutionalized practices from sport, we have to be mindful so we don't repeat the same issues. Another thing related to that, women and gender minority esports leagues, there's a lot of good in them. There's also a very acute and actual danger. They will naturalize separation of genders, akin to traditional sports. So what I'm trying to say here, when we look at the structure and the institutional structure and institutional level, we have to be mindful of these different things that come in a way. A third thing that I'm going to mention briefly here is the fact that games are made by companies that want to make profit. And this will always be a factor because esports is unique in a way in comparison to a lot of traditional sports that the companies own the IPs. So as Veli-Matti Kauklahti has argued, in his 2017 paper, we might not want to even talk about electronic sports. We might want to talk about executive sports. The games we play are owned by someone. You can be having an esports tournament, and the game developer can come and update the game middle of your tournament. And what you gonna do? I loved Overwatch. It doesn't exist. It's Overwatch 2 now. I don't want that. Like, how dare they? Give me my game back. I paid for it. They don't care. It was never my game. These games are never our games. The games we use in the institutional context is never our games. And within here lies a little bit of an issue. Let's say in Finland, we recognize one esport above others, CSGO. Everything is CSGO. When there's tournaments, those making tournaments quite often want to make CSGO tournaments. Why? Well, it makes sense. That's what people recognize as esports. It's mostly played. It has most viewers. However, then we tend to follow these as academic esports as well, because this is what the young people want to play, right? When we do that, though, we bring, and I have to speed up because I'm taking way too long, we bring with it a number of culture structures that has been embedded within this system. So when we, as in the educational context, we are like, okay, these young people, they want to play CSGO. That's their game. We want to give it to them, so we give it to them. At the same time, we take part to exclusionary practices. First-person shooters are notoriously known for their toxic environment, and not just toxic environment, but especially for minorities. Everybody gets their share, don't get me wrong. But often the language used is racist and gendered, and especially minorities are actively and have been actively excluded. So when we choose that as our game, we also make the choice that those who are already in a position of power within that culture will continue their hegemony. These are never neutral. And then there comes the social structures. When we do that, we again strengthen their position and strengthen the exclusionary practices and hinder the participation of the minority groups. The last thing I wanted to talk really briefly, if we don't have much time, is the affective structures. So with all these structures, there's always a level of affect, which is the sort of pre-personal thing that precedes emotion. So let's say the person who wants to play a auto character than Mercy within a game chooses that character, they will get active pushback. There is an active pushback to that act. They might be denied resources, they might be name called, they might be shunned, they might be excluded. So this is sort of the level of where we operate, and we are pushed to the normative structures. Everyone who participates also becomes part of the affective structures within which our agency is both limited and opened, within which our wants and needs are regulated in relation to the situation. It's really hard to change these things, even when and I think that's one of the strengths of the institutional level of academic esports, that we take it to another institution where we can start changing things. But it's still, institutional change is difficult and slow, and we have to face that. There is institutional brick walls that we will face, and that's not necessarily academic institutions, but any kind of institution. So we can also hope that combining it to another institution will help us. Diversity labor, it tends to fall on the minority groups, the people who are already disproportionately in precarious and vulnerable position. It tends to fall on women, people of color, and minorities, and it's exhausting. It burns people out, and you don't get much out of it, you know? You get much more out of it if you follow the affective structures. If you do not push and poke, if you accept the push, you get more out. And you always run the risk to become the feminist killjoy. Everyone else is having fun doing esports. Why are you doing that with us? Leave us alone. Everything is going cool. The feminist killjoy does not only become someone who kills the joy, it eventually becomes the one who is blamed for the issues. So that's just it's a really good book from Sarah Ahmed, those interested, explicating this progress, how that who makes the complaint does not only become the complainer, but also the one that is accused. One way out of that, I think it's very interesting, is outrage epistemology. It's a feminist approach, which sort of like utilizes these points of pushback and how our bodies can gather knowledge through them. I think it also goes back to the Sam's point earlier, the first day presentation, like who are we researching and who are the researchers? What kind of bodies are producing the knowledge? As this feminist outrage epistemology brings forth that not all that knowledge is also embodied. Certain knowledge can be only accessed through embodied practices and embodied positions. There is certain knowledge that only certain type of bodies, disabled bodies, gendered bodies can access. So we need that diversity in those who partake to these activities, be it as educators, be it as researchers, be it as participants. And when we have participants, we need to listen to testimonies and empower the different voices. We need to stop the shush. That's so important, because then when we don't listen to testimonies, when we don't empower different voices, we do not only do ethical injustice, we do epistemological injustice. We deny forms of knowledge. So let's empower voices, let's listen testimonies. Let's have constant reflectivity in our works. When we think about bringing a game to play in our academic esports program, let's think about twice, is it CSGO or is it something else? And I loved seeing the dance match here. That is such a diverse esports practice. So let's choose different kind of games. Let's think critically, what is seen as a skill in the game that we chose? Because that's critically examining the barriers of participation. We need to recognize them in the most granular levels. What do we promote as a skill? What do we see as an esports game? And distribute the labor, for God's sake. Do not have those who are in the most vulnerable position do the labor. Distribute the labor, take on the labor. And that being said, I think in that sense, we are actually at the core of esports with these questions, because we are defining what academic esports is. Thank you.